Hello, students. Today we'll be dealing with the topic environment and ecology. First of all, why are we studying this subject? For two reasons. Firstly, because as a responsible citizen and a human being on this planet Earth, we need to value the resources that Earth provides us. We need to conserve and protect our environment. We need to sustain it for the future generations and respect everything that the earth gives us. But secondly, and more importantly for us, we need to learn this subject and have an emotion towards this subject as a civil servant. Because when we enter the government, we will be playing and we should play a very important role in conservation of our environment and ecology. We not only have to be an important part of the process, but also be able to include and involve every section of the society in doing the same. For this, we need to be aware about the various concepts related to environment and ecology. We also need to understand why it is important for us to conserve our environment because it gives us not only the basic necessities for a very living, like fresh air, clean water, forest, land, soil, but also plays a very important role in our economy. It provides us with various goods and services, with various resources, mineral resources, and various other things. And hence it is very valuable as a resource. To interrelate environment with various subjects, with our economy, with our society, and how we can use this to our best without exploiting them and sustaining them for future generations. You need to have an overall understanding and a very wide perspective on this subject, the basic concepts, so that you can link it to other subjects and then apply it once you become a civil servant. With that point in perspective, let's move ahead. The very first understanding that you need to have is about the nature of the subject. In the past 3 to 4 years, the subject has become very dynamic in terms of the questions asked by UPSC, both in prelims as well as mains examination. To fulfill that demand, you need to understand the basic concepts according to the syllabus, but it doesn't stop there. You need to acquaint and equip yourself with various weapons like your current affairs, with daily happenings around you, what you infer from them, and what could be the solutions to those problems. You can be very innovative when it comes to mains examination, but prelims examination and mains both require conceptual clarity and understanding of the subject. So let's start with the syllabus so that we know what are the main and underlying concepts that you need to know. The syllabus. When it comes to the prelims examination, it includes general issues on environment and ecology. It also includes biodiversity, climate change, and it also mentions that all of this does not require subject specialization, which is a very important point. While studying UPSC, one very important mistake that many aspirants make is they tend to do an in depth study in each and every subject, which is a waste of time and it is not required because we don't have to become environmentalist. Rather, we need to first clear this examination and then we can do something great for our environment. And then, if required, study in depth. But right now, our focus should be to clear this examination. And for that, we have to have certain restrictions, certain boundaries that we need to maintain, and do only material and study only material that is relevant to this examination and stick to the syllabus. When it comes to the mains examination, we have topics like conservation, environmental pollution, degradation, and environmental impact assessment. These are the main topics, and apart from that, there are several other topics which we will go on adding in relation to the current affairs. These answers have to be very dynamic. They have to we have to relate it to current affairs when we write a mains examination, and you also need to use that knowledge in application based prelims questions. So let's go to the next part. We'll start with understanding the ecology. So today's chapter is ecology. What do you mean by ecology? Ecology is the scientific study of reciprocal relationship between organisms, including microbes, plants, animals, man with their environment. How they make use of their environmental resources, including energy flow and mineral cycling. So, if you pay attention to this diagram, you can see how it shows that different organisms and their environment are interrelated to each other. This is very true in case of every ecological relationship. We all are dependent on each other. We have a reciprocal relationship. There is a give and a take between organisms, between each other, and also with their society. How we make use of our environmental resources. As we know that every organism gets its energy from the sun. When you talk about plants, they derive energy from the sun, and then the entire food chain follows, which we will be seeing further. So let's start with the history of ecology. As old as human civilization itself, ecology is as old as a human civilization. The knowledge of environment for survival, that is, when man lived in the wild, they were aware about the forces of nature, the plants, animals around him or her. They couldn't live in ignorance. They had to know all these aspects when they lived in the wild. Why? Again, so that they are aware of the resources that could be useful to them and also protect themselves from wild animals. Next, how do we know that they were aware about these things? Because ancient texts have references to ecological principles. What are those ancient texts? Like your Vedas, your Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, Indian treatise on medicine, that is the Charak Samhita, and surgical texts, that is the Sushrut Samhitas. All of them have references to ecological principles. They talk about their environment and ecology. This shows us that they had a sense of their environment and ecology. Next, what do they contain? These books contain classification of animals on the basis of their habit and habitat. Land in terms of nature of soil, climate, vegetation. Description of plants typical to various localities. So, all of this information was present in these ancient texts. Next is the Charak Samhita also has information that air, land, water, and seasons were indispensable for life. They knew the importance of these resources to them. They also knew that polluted air and water were injurious to health. So that gives us the understanding of how aware they were. So, with that note, let's move to the next slide. Environment. What is environment? Before that, let's just see what is ecology, because you need to be very aware about the definitions, because whenever you get any question in mains examination, you need to know the definition of the keyword in order to begin your answer or write your answer very constructively in the least possible amount of words to give maximum expression. So let's revise again. What is ecology? Ecology is the scientific study of reciprocal relationship. So what are the keywords you're going to remember in this, in the definition of ecology, is the reciprocal relationship. Secondly, you have to remember that this reciprocal relationship is between organisms with their environment. Okay? And how they make use of those environmental resources. So let's revise. What is ecology? It is a reciprocal relationship between organisms. In brackets, you can write the various types of organisms and then those organisms with their environment. Then we saw the history of ecology, how it is as old as the human civilization, and various ancient texts give references to these ecological principles. Now we look at the definition of environment. Now, what is an environment? Everything that surrounds or affects an organism during its lifetime is collectively known as its environment. It comprises both living and non living components. All organisms are dependent on the environment for food, energy, water, oxygen, shelter, and other needs. Environment is nothing but living plus non living, the various influences and events surrounding an organism. To understand this better, let us see some components of the environment. So, if you see the components of the environment, it can be divided into two: biotic, abiotic and biotic components. When we talk about abiotic components, it includes energy, radiation, temperature and heat flow, atmospheric gases and wind, fire, gravity, topography, soil, and geologic substratum. When we come to biotic factors or components, it includes green plants, non green plants, decomposers, parasites, symbionts, animals, man. So let's go back. So let's go back to the definition. What does the definition say? Everything that surrounds or affects an organism. So here the key word is surrounds or affects an organism during its lifetime, and it comprises both living, that is what we just saw, the biotic factors, and it also includes non living, that is abiotic factors or components. Okay? So, don't you think that energy, radiation, temperature, gases, fire, gravity, soil, all of these affect an organism during its lifetime or surround an organism? Yes. So, these are the abiotic components of the environment. When it comes to biotic components, we are surrounded by plants, green plants, non green plants, decomposers, parasites, symbionts, which we'll be dealing with this in the later chapters, animals, man. In short, let me tell you the meaning of symbionts. Where two organisms are mutually dependent on each other, they are called symbionts. The best example for this is the bacteria living on the roots of leguminous plants. So, these bacteria take shelter on the roots while the roots provide them with nutrition. So, this is to give you a fair idea of what is an environment, what are the components of an environment. So, let's move ahead. There are two types of environment. One is the external environment, and the other is your internal environment. Now, it is very easily understandable and very easily differentiable. Something that is out of your body and affects you is your external environment, and something that is within the body of an organism is called its internal environment. Example: external environment of a fish. Now, if you imagine a fish living in an ocean, what could be the external environment of that fish? So let's do it in the same manner as the previous slide. That is, we'll divide it into abiotic and biotic components. So, what are the abiotic components in the external environment of a fish? It includes components like light, temperature, oxygen, and other nutrients. It could also include biotic components. What are the biotic components? Microorganisms like plankton. What are plankton? They are nothing but microscopic plants living in an ocean. It also includes aquatic plants, that is, normal plants, animals, and decomposers. Okay? So, this comprises the external environment of a fish that consists of abiotic as well as biotic components. Let's go to the next, that is the internal environment of the fish. Now, when I take this example, how is the internal environment of any organism? In this case, the fish. It is relatively stable as compared to your external environment, but it is not absolutely constant. Of course, there are things like injury, stress, illness that upset the internal environment. For example, if a marine fish is transferred to freshwater fish, it will not be able to survive. So, this is the external environment and the internal environment concept, which we understood using an example. Let's move ahead. Levels of organization in ecology. The first organism or the first level of an ecology is, of course, an individual or an organism. So, this is the first level, that is the individual level. When we move up, there's population. That is, this can also be written as a single species. Many species, many organisms, or individuals, when they come together, they form a population. If you have watched the movie Finding Nemo, let's take the example of this picture. This is an individual fish. Many fishes of the same species form a population. When that fish is living in an environment with other fish, it forms a community. So let's move up, that the next level is a community. Many communities, when they come together and interact with their environment, forms an ecosystem. So this will form an aquatic ecosystem in this case. So I hope it is clear to you what are the levels of organization. Let's use this diagram as well. Here is an individual population of different individuals belonging to the same species, how they interact with the other organisms around them belonging to different species, and then finally how they interact with their environment. And finally, how many ecosystems come together to form a biome, and this comes together to form a biosphere. So, let's revise. An individual, many species of the same, many individuals of the same species forms a population. Many species living together in an environment forms a community. When all these different species living in an environment interact with their environment, it together forms an ecosystem. So, what is an ecosystem? It is organisms of different species, or you can say different populations of different species coming together and interacting with their environment and also among themselves forms an ecosystem. Many ecosystems form a biome, and many biomes come together to form a biosphere. You can also use this diagram to understand the same. Now, what are these terms? Ecosystem, biome, and biosphere we'll be dealing with ahead. So, what is an ecosystem? So, in this slide, we already saw what is an individual, what is a population, what is a community, and now we'll be seeing an ecosystem. So, let me revise again. An individual is a single organism of a single species. Then you have population, that is many individuals belonging to the same species. Then you have a community, that is many organisms belonging to different species. And then you have an ecosystem, that is different organisms belonging to different species interacting among themselves and also with their environment, which forms an ecosystem. Let's see it in let's look at it in a definition format. So what is an ecosystem? So as I told you, when you have to define, keywords are very important. So what is an ecosystem? Ecosystem is a structural and functional unit of biosphere consisting of community of living beings and their physical environment both interacting and exchanging materials between them. So let's go to the previous slide and understand this definition. So, what is an ecosystem? Ecosystem is a structural and functional unit of the biosphere. So, it is a unit of your biosphere where a community of living beings are living and interacting with each other and also with their environment, forming an ecosystem which itself is a functional unit of biosphere. So, if possible, try and memorize the definition of ecology, environment, and ecosystem. So, what is an ecology? Ecology is the scientific study of reciprocal relationship between organisms with each other and with their environment. So, the word study is important over here. It is a scientific study, ecology. As we all know that logy means study, for example, biology, physiology, anything. So the word scientific study is very important in definition of ecology. When you talk about environment, you need to use the key terms such as surrounding, affecting, okay, everything that surrounds or affects an organism during its lifetime. Then you can talk about the non-living and living components, that is biotic, abiotic components. Okay, when it comes to ecosystem, you have to mention keywords like structural and functional unit of biosphere consisting of community of living beings and physical environment interacting and exchanging materials between them. So once you learn the keywords of the definitions and you use them in your answers, they look very constructive, very consolidated, and very well expressed using limited number of words. Next is, as we already saw the components of an environment, here we'll be seeing the components of an ecosystem. The abiotic components almost overlap. So let's see what are the abiotic components. It includes energy, rainfall, temperature, atmosphere, substratum, materials like organic and inorganic compounds, latitude, and altitude. As we have already seen a diagram on ecosystem, we can relate to the abiotic factors like radiation, fire, moisture, that is rain, the temperature, and the minerals, and all other components of an ecosystem. Let's go to the biotic components. The biotic components include primary producers, consumers, macro and micro consumers, and all these organisms form your biotic components. Now, each and every biotic component I'll just explain to you in short. So, what are primary producers? First, you have to come to the basics. Our environment provides us with energy. From where do we get energy? Energy comes from the sun. Are we able to utilize the energy that sun provides us? No. That can be utilized by primary producers that are autotrophs. These autotrophs are self nourishing. The best example for autotrophs are plants, green plants. These utilize the energy from the sun and convert it into usable form of energy, carbohydrates, and other forms of energy. These plants are then eaten by others or other organisms who are called the consumers. These consumers may be heterotrophs or phagotrophs, that is, they feed on other organisms. Take, for example, a cow. A cow goes and eats a plant. So the plant is an autotroph, the cow is a heterotroph. It may also be a phagotroph. We'll be looking at these terms in detail as we move ahead. Within consumers, you have two kinds of consumers. First are the macro consumers, and next we have micro consumers. If we look at macro consumers, we have herbivores, for example, cow. We have secondary consumers that eat the herbivores or feed on the herbivores who are called secondary consumers. For example, wolf. Then you have the carnivores who feed on flesh or meat eating animals. And then you have omnivores, for example, man, monkey, etc., who feed both on plants as well as animals. These are your macro consumers. When we talk about micro consumers, they include saprotrophs. Saprotrophs are nothing but your decomposers or osmotrophs. These include bacteria, fungi. They are also called detrivores, that is, they feed on dead and decaying organisms. For example, earthworm. Okay? So now, once these bacteria, fungi, earthworm use the nutrition from dead and decaying organisms, these products are used by the producers, and thus this entire cycle is completed. Okay? So let's move on to the next slide. Classification of ecosystem. This is the natural ecosystem. Natural ecosystem can be classified into two, the terrestrial and aquatic. In terrestrial ecosystem, we have three kinds in broad terms. We have the forest, the grasslands, and the deserts. There may be many other terrestrial ecosystems, but these are the major ones, or it's the major classification. When we go to aquatic, there are three major classifications: freshwater, saline water, and marine water. Let's move to the next slide. Now, what are the goods and services provided by ecosystem? As I already told you in the beginning, as civil servants, we need to conserve our ecosystem for ethical reasons, to conserve it as a human being, as a species living on planet Earth, as a citizen, as someone who's worried to sustain these resources for the future generations as a responsible citizen, but also We conserve these ecosystems and resources because they provide us with certain goods and services that we use as resources. So let's see what are the resources or what are the goods and services that our ecosystem provides us with. First is nutrition, materials, and energy. When it comes to nutrition, they provide us with food. For example, green plants provide us with fresh fruits. They give us soil. Our environment and ecology gives us fertile soil for production of food crops. They also give us fresh water from the rivers and streams. When it comes to materials, they provide us with raw material, for example, rubber, honey. They also give us genetic resources. The best example is BT cotton, which can be modified and used. Another concept that covered in my previous science and technology lecture. They also provide us with medicinal resources. What is naturopathy? Ayurveda. Use of natural resources that our ecosystem and environment provides us with. And also ornamental resources, for example, pearls, gold, silver. All of these are available readily in nature. Next is with energy. It captures the energy of the sun and provides us with energy, starting from primary producers to consumers, macro and micro consumers, and then you have the tertiary consumers. And then it goes back to your decomposers, and the entire food chain is completed. So, all the energy along the food chain comes from our environment. Next, our ecosystem also helps us in regulating and maintenance of our environment. Or, in other words, I could say that it regulates itself and maintains itself for our use and also for the balance in nature. For example, regulation of waste, air purification, waste treatment like water purification. There are various bacteria that help in purification of water. This is nature's way of treating itself. For example, if you go to a beach and if you stand outside on the seashore during high tide, you'll see how the sea throws away all the waste onto the seashore. This is nature's way of cleaning up. So, air purification and waste treatment. Next, flow regulation, disturbance prevention or moderation. The best example I can give you for this are mangroves. Mangroves help in preventing tsunamis, and they also do not allow them to reach with the same impact onto the shores or onto the coastline, on the coast. So, mangroves are used as a method for mitigating tsunamis and other coastal disasters. Next, regulation of water flows. For example, you have the high tide, the low tide, upstream, downstream. All this regulation is done by nature. When we learn the seashore or the ocean flow, we will understand how the ocean floor is made up of various upturns, downturns, and there are also different methods. For example, exogenetic and endogenetic forces that help in regulation of water flows, water levels, and balancing the entire bed. We also have erosion prevention. For example, trees. They hold the soil, and along with that, they hold the water present in the soil. Next, next one, regulation of physical environment. For example, they help in carbon sequestration, in climate regulation. The ocean absorbs the CO2 gas. We also have we also have our plants which help in sequestration of carbon. It also helps in maintaining soil fertility by itself, by rejuvenating itself. Next is regulation of biotic environment. That is your gene pool protection. It prevents invasive species from attacking that particular ecosystem by various defense mechanisms and various adaptations. Next is the life cycle maintenance. It also helps every organism by giving them certain adaptations, by helping them to maintain their life cycle, by giving them different roles in the ecosystem. When we do the concept of niche, we'll understand better how every organism has a different place in the society, a different function, a different habitat niche, a different food niche that helps them in their survival, that helps them to complete their life cycle, which helps them to complete their reproductive cycle. Another example is pollination, how different organisms are interrelated to each other. For example, a honeybee, it goes and it also sucks the nectar from a flower while also helps in pollination. Next is biological control. For example, lizards eat mosquitoes. So there are various interrelations between different organisms to regulate their biotic environment as well as regulation of waste, flow regulation, and various other things. Let's go to cultural. They are very symbolic. We get information from our environment for cognitive development. We understand the balance that needs to be maintained. Next, intellectual and experiential. It gives us aesthetic information, inspiration for culture, art, and design, spiritual experience, recreation, and tourism. So, these are the different things, the goods and services that our ecosystem provides us with, and that is the reason we need to value, respect, and conserve these ecosystems. Let's move to the next one, ecotone. What is an ecotone? The intermediate portion between two ecosystems can be called an ecotone. For example, this is ecosystem 1 and this is ecosystem 2. Okay, so do you think nature has a black and white line between these two ecosystems? No. There is a transition zone. This transition zone is called your ecotone. Let's take an example. Look at this diagram given here. This is a land ecosystem and this is an aquatic ecosystem. This transitional zone is called your ecotone. So let's see how organisms live in an ecotone. Here there's a tortoise. This could also go into the water and could also live a little bit on land. This could also be taken as a turtle actually. Then you have a duck which also lives on land and lays its egg in on the land, which lives in the water, goes to swim, and then comes and lays its egg on land. You can also take an example of birds. They have their nest on the trees, and when they need to drink water or eat fish, they go into the water. So let's see what is an ecotone and the various functions. Firstly, let's cover the characteristics of an ecotone. Ecotone is nothing but a zone of junction. Again, your keywords are very, very important. It is a zone of junction. Examples could be mangroves, grassland, estuary, riverbank. What are the characteristics of an ecotone? It can be narrow or wide. It can be intermediate to, it is in fact intermediate to adjacent ecosystems. As I gave you an example, ecotone 1, ecotone 2, they are adjacent to two ecosystems and it forms the intermediary area. Next is it has linear incoming and outgoing species. For example, if you look at this diagram, as I go from this side to this side, the terrestrial or the reptiles will decrease and your aquatic animals will increase. And when I move from this side to this side, the number of terrestrial organisms will increase and aquatic organisms will decrease. Next characteristic, they have certain organisms which are entirely different from both the ecosystems and are confined to this particular ecotone. For example, many ecotones around the world have certain specific species that are native to the ecotone and are completely different from ecosystem 1 and 2. Next is, so it gives us diversity. Next is the edge effect. This is a very important concept and very important from your prelims question point of view. So, what is the edge effect? If you see that, if I give you an example of a bird again, that this bird is, living between the forest and the aquatic ecosystem. So, of course, it gets resources from both water as well as land. So, isn't this an ideal place for any organism that depends both on water and land to live in? So, this tends to increase the diversity of organisms living in an ecotone. So, this is a population of some species that are greater in this zone than either community. This is called your edge effect. So, if you have to define an edge effect, you can say that it is a phenomena in which there is population of some species which are greater in the ecotone than your either community. This is called your edge effect, where your population is greater in your ecotone than your either community. Let's move to the next. Niche. Niche is a very, very important concept to be understood. And also from your examination and conceptual clarity point of view. Now, what is a niche? I also mentioned this before. What is a niche? Let's understand. I'm very sure that you already know what is a habitat. A habitat is a place where an animal lives. As we know, animals have a tendency of being territorial. They have a tendency to mark their territories. So they form their habitat in that territory. They form their entire home in such a place where all the required resources are available in the nearby area. Microscopic plants like phytoplankton and microscopic animals like zooplankton. This euphotic zone is the zone where these phytoplankton feed or where they use the sunlight. The entire zone up to which the fishes, the small fishes, and all stay is called the entire thing, including your euphotic zone, is called your photic zone. It's just like this is the entire photic zone, and the uppermost layer is called your euphotic zone, where you have various kinds of phytoplankton and zooplankton. Especially here, you can talk about phytoplankton who use the sunlight for their growth. Next is, if you look at this coastal area, or basically technically called the continental shelf, there is a high tide line and a low tide line. Low tide and high tide, sorry. So if we see that this intertidal zone is the zone between your high tide and low tide, then you have your neritic zone where you have small organisms, and then finally it enters into your euphotic photic zone. Now, when we go to the other zones, you have your benthic zone, which is at the ocean floor. You also have your aphotic zone, which is the zone where sunlight does not penetrate. Your photic zone and aphotic zone together forms your pelagic zone. So all these zones are important to understand which organism or which aquatic animal thrives in which area and uses what kind of food and what kind of nutrition and from where it sources these. So, in short, let's again revise this slide. We saw that there is a euphotic zone, which includes the zone where these phytoplankton use energy of sunlight through direct penetration, which forms the uppermost layer. The maximum zone where sunlight penetrates is called, together with your euphotic zone, the photic zone. Below that, you have your aphotic zone. The photic and aphotic zone together forms your pelagic zone. The zone at the ocean floor is called your benthic zone. Let's move now to the next slide. Just like we saw zones in an ocean, let's also see zones in a lake. These are slightly different. First, let's look up to this diagram. Now, what is this? Just like your ocean zone, here you have your benthic zone, which is at the ocean floor. Remember benthos as the ocean floor, it's the lowermost layer always. Then you have your littoral zone. What is littoral zone? It is just at the banks of the river. It's like a transition zone. Then you have your profundal zone and your limnetic zone. To understand your limnetic and profundal zone, let's move to this diagram. So first, let's see habitat versus ecosystem. Habitat is the natural home of an organism, whereas ecosystem includes all communities of living organisms and their relationships with physical environment in a geographic area. A habitat is small compared to an ecosystem. An ecosystem is always larger than a habitat. Habitat lies within an ecosystem, whereas one ecosystem could contain many habitats. Next is a collection of habitats make an ecosystem, whereas a collection of ecosystems make the large unit of biomes. As we have already studied, that ecosystems are nothing but structural and functional unit of biomes. One habitat contains one or few species, whereas one ecosystem contains a very large number of species. Next point is in regards to your trophic levels. We have already studied trophic levels, but I have not given you the word. We just studied about primary producers and then we went on to consumers and we also studied about decomposers and the entire chain. Primary producers are your autotrophs or plants. Within consumers, we had primary consumers or your herbivores. Then we saw omnivores, carnivores, secondary, tertiary consumers, and we saw decomposers or your saprophytes. Depending on whether the chain is of a grassland food chain or whether it is a detritus food chain, your decomposers will move up or down the trophic levels. This each level where one organism is feeding on another organism, leading to transfer of nutrition and energy, is called your trophic level. We will be dealing with this in the next chapters. For now, just understand that your habitat contains only a few trophic levels, whereas your ecosystem contains all the trophic levels. Coming back to what is a niche. To understand that, let's look at types of niche. Niche, in short, is nothing but the functional role of an organism in an ecosystem. For example, let's again come to types of niche. Habitat niche, where it lives. Food niche, what it eats or decomposes. The species it competes with. Reproductive niche, how and when it reproduces. The physical and chemical niche, the temperature, land, shape, just correct this, temperature, land, shape, land slope, humidity, and other requirements of an organism. This forms, this All of these things give it a specific role and a function to play in an ecosystem, and that is called its niche. Let's talk about habitat niche. For example, if you look at this picture, you can see that there are different species of birds that are living in different levels of a tree given over here. This is called your habitat niche, the habitat which it occupies in an ecosystem. Next is your food niche, what it eats or decomposes, what species it competes with. For example, look at this diagram. These are your feeding niches. Now, these are different kinds of birds. You can see the flamingo and various other kinds of birds. Now, all of these, if you look at this picture, are feeding but in different areas. So, these are called, or this is called your food niche, what it eats and what species it competes with for your eating. So, nature is structured in such a way where each organism has food to eat, and when there is an imbalance, there are too many organisms competing for a particular food niche, and that leads to competition, and that leads to your predation prey relationship. For example, if you see your savanna grasslands, how the lions chase the deers because they are both competing for the same, in the same habitat niche or in the same food niche, habitat niche I could say, because deers are deer, they are herbivorous animals. Next you have the physical and chemical niche. For example, you'll find polar bears only in the polar areas, or you'll find a particular species in a desert area. Coming to this previous picture, there's another question posed: do two organisms have exactly the same niche? The answer is no. Mostly to avoid competition, as I already told you, nature has created a specific area, a specific food, reproductive, and habitat niche for each and every organism until it is in balance. After that, there's competition. Let's look at this: owl and a hawk. They both eat rodents. They both, but owl is active during nighttime and hawk during daytime. Next is owl hunts in forest, whereas hawk hunts in grasslands. Owl nest in low trees, whereas hawks nest in tall trees. Niches can overlap, but they are never exactly the same. For example, they may have the same food niche, like both are eating rodents, but they're active during different types. During different times, they hunt in different places, and their habitat niches are different. This decreases competition and makes room for many species. Let's move ahead. Biome. As we already saw, that the highest level after an ecosystem is a biome, and many biomes come together to form the biosphere. So let's see the definition of a biome. Terrestrial parts of the biosphere, which are divided into various parts based on climate, vegetation, animal life, and general soil type, is called a biome. This is a biome chart. Based on your temperature and based on your moisture, they can be divided from wet to dry and hot to cold biomes. For example, if you take the Arctic region, has a tundra biome. There are different kinds of vegetation and different animals, flora, fauna living in these kind of biomes. Then you have the subarctic, which has a taiga vegetation. Then you have the temperate, which has temperate forest, temperate grassland, and desert kind of vegetation. Then you have the tropical biome, which includes rainforest, savanna, and desert. Understanding this is very important to understand the ecological niche of different organisms. There are many niche, there are many ecological, sorry, there are different names of biomes, as we just saw: the tundra, the taiga, the temperate deciduous forest, tropical rainforest, savanna, grassland, desert, which we just saw over here, which is based on the vegetation, moisture, dry, wet, and the temperature, hot or cold. We already saw the tundra. So let's see the classification in little more detail. This diagram is just for a fair understanding because we'll be doing each and every biome in detail as separate chapters in the classes to come. So let's see this tundra region. This tundra region is adjoining the ice-bound poles. If you look at the taiga region, it includes your North Europe, Asia, North America. It's also known, the forest are also known as boreal forest. All these terms are very important from prelims point of view. Next, you have your temperate deciduous forest, which extends over Central and Southern Europe, Eastern North America, Western China, Japan, New Zealand, etc. Let's not go more in detail right now, and there are various flora and fauna. So let's not go in detail right now because these will be dealt with as separate chapters. Let's move ahead. If you have noticed that when we discussed biome, it only talks about terrestrial parts of the biosphere. But biosphere also includes some aquatic parts, but they are not called biomes. They are called zones. This is another important prelims question. So if it includes only terrestrial parts, they are called biome, but aquatic parts are divided into zones. So let's see this. So as you can see, that this is an ocean bed. It has a continental shelf, continental slope, abyssal zone, benthic, and different parts. Now let's see the different zones. This is a euphotic zone. Now, what do you mean by euphotic zone? Euphotic zone means the zone where sunlight can penetrate. This zone is also called the photic zone. In fact, the uppermost layer where light penetrates is called your euphotic zone, and the maximum area where light penetrates, the entire part, it's almost synonymous, but you can still differentiate. Okay, now this zone is called your photic zone. So we know that photic means nothing but light. So, photic zone means the region where sunlight can penetrate. Now, why are we focusing on sunlight? Because your aquatic plants need sunlight to grow just like your terrestrial plants. It also helps in these plants include your macro plants like your normal aquatic plants, and it also includes microscopic plants like phytoplankton and microscopic animals like zooplankton. This euphotic zone is the zone where these phytoplankton feed or where they use the sunlight. The entire zone up to which the small fishes, and all stay is called the entire thing, including your euphotic zone, is called your photic zone. It's just like this is the entire photic zone, and the uppermost layer is called your euphotic zone, where you have various kinds of phytoplankton and zooplankton. Especially here, you can talk about phytoplankton who use the sunlight for their growth. Next is, if you look at this coastal area, or basically technically called the continental shelf, there is a high tide line and a low tide line. Low tide and high tide, sorry. So if we see that this intertidal zone is the zone between your high tide and low tide, then you have your neritic zone where you have small organisms, and then finally it enters into your euphotic photic zone. Now when we go to the other zones, you have your benthic zone, which is at the ocean floor. You also have your aphotic zone, which is the zone where sunlight does not penetrate. Your photic zone and aphotic zone together forms your pelagic zone. So all these zones are important to understand which organism or which aquatic animal thrives in which area and uses what kind of food and what kind of nutrition and from where it sources these. So in short, let's again revise this slide. We saw that there is a euphotic zone, which includes the zone where these phytoplankton use energy of sunlight through direct penetration, which forms the uppermost layer. The maximum zone where sunlight penetrates is called, together with your euphotic zone, the photic zone. Below that, you have your aphotic zone. The photic and aphotic zone together forms your pelagic zone. The zone at the ocean floor is called your benthic zone. Let's move now to the next slide. Just like we saw zones in an ocean, let's also see zones in a lake. These are slightly different. First, let's look up to this diagram. Now, what is this? Just like your ocean zone, here you have your benthic zone, which is at the ocean floor. Remember benthos as the ocean floor, it's the lowermost layer always. Then you have your littoral zone. What is littoral zone? It is just at the banks of the river. It's like a transition zone. Then you have your profundal zone and your limnetic zone. To understand your limnetic and profundal zone, let's move to this diagram. Okay, so here you have your littoral zone, as we already saw, which is the transition zone. Next, we have, just like we saw in the ocean zones, over here as well, we have a photic zone where your light penetrates and the aphotic zone where your light does not penetrate. Limnetic zone and profundal zone are just another names to them. Your photic zone is called your limnetic zone and aphotic zone is also called profundal zone. Benthic zone is just as we already discussed, that is, it is the lowermost part of your lake bed, just like in the ocean zones. So if we look at this diagram, we can figure out if this is a lake. These two areas are your littoral zones. This top part forms your limnetic zone and the lower parts form your benthic zone. And then the part where sunlight does not penetrate is called your aphotic or your profundal zone. I hope this entire diagram is very clear. Next, we'll move to types of aquatic ecosystems. What are the different types of aquatic ecosystems in broad terms? We have freshwater ecosystems, transitional communities, and marine ecosystems. When we look at freshwater ecosystems, let's take some examples. Standing water, lakes and ponds, moving water, rivers and streams. Like if you look at the diagrams given to your right hand side, you have streams and rivers, ponds, lakes, aquifers and springs. All of these are included in your freshwater ecosystem. There are certain characteristics of freshwater ecosystem which we'll be dealing with ahead. Next is the transitional communities. Transitional communities are also one kind of ecotones, as they form a transition zone between two different ecosystems, land and water. These include estuaries where rivers meet the sea, you have wetlands, swamps, marshes, bogs, fens. Let's look at the diagrams. Wetlands, estuaries. Both of these form your transitional communities. Next, you have your marine ecosystem. Your shorelines, barrier islands, coral reefs, open ocean. Coral reefs, barrier islands, shorelines, they all need to be understood, which we will be dealing with in the further chapters. This is the example, like for example, you have diagrams of oceans right here. So these are the different types of aquatic ecosystems which can be classified majorly into freshwater ecosystem, transitional communities, and marine ecosystems. Let's move on to the final level, that is your biosphere. We started with an individual, or we can also call it a particular species or a single organism. From there, we learned what is a population. Population is nothing but many organisms of same species. We then learned what is a community. Community is different species living together. And then we finally learned what is an ecosystem. Ecosystem is different species living with the environment and interacting between each other. We then went on to learn what is a entire with ecosystem. We also moved on to niche, and we also moved on to understanding the different biomes and different zones. Then finally, we came to biome in terms of terrestrial, and okay, let's also write zones in case of aquatic. And then now finally, we have reached to the biosphere. We started with the ecosystem, which is the structural unit of biosphere, and now we have reached the biosphere. So let's see what is this biosphere. So that's it for today. I hope you have understood each and every concept in relation to the chapter Ecology. We'll also be learning more about this in relation to other topics in future lessons. So today we started with what is environment and ecology as a subject. We then saw the syllabus, the nature of this subject, what needs to be learned in terms of your pre as well as main syllabus. Then we came down to the chapter 1, ecology. We learned the main definitions, that is the environment definition, the definition for ecology, definition for an ecosystem. We learned what the different characteristics and components of an environment and ecosystem. Then we came down to understanding biome, niche. Then we understood the different aspects of each and every topic. And finally, we arrived at what is the biosphere. The underlying idea of this entire chapter is to give you a brief as to why this subject is to give you an understanding, in fact, of why this subject needs to be understood and why it is important for a civil servant to be aware about each and every concept in relation to the environment and ecology, so that with a wholesome preparation, with a wholesome and a very bright scope of understanding, with a very wide perspective, one can then take very important decisions in an informed manner. Thank you very much, students. This is the end of my lecture. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.